Welcome to our Méliès book launch and film screening. I think we have a once-in-a-lifetime event here for you. Never before have two books on Georges Méliès come out at the same time. And after 120 years of laying in the vaults at the Library of Congress, we have a Méliès film that has not been widely seen since 1902. I hope you enjoy what is to come. And my name is Matthew Solomon. I teach film history and film theory at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I've been at work on Méliès, these two books for the last 11 years. This is the culmination, and I'm very happy you could be here with us today. Our run of show, we'll have some thank yous for our generous sponsors and supporters. You'll hear from a few of our very important key collaborators. You'll hear my remarks about Méliès the manufacturer. And for a main event, you will see 3 zero-gravity films made by Georges Méliès in 1902, including one, an marvelous suspension evolution that has not been widely seen in quite some time. After that, we'll open it up for the Q&A. So at any time, you can enter questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. If you are using Zoom, the optimal way to experience this webinar is in the side-by-side format. If you go to the upper right of your screen, I'd advise you to enter side-by-side. So our most important co-sponsor is the University of Research Opportunity Program here at Michigan. And I want to thank Michelle Ferez, Cynthia Caden, Luciana Neptunu. Without their support, none of this would have been possible in quite the way that you see it today. Also want to give my thanks to the University of Michigan Press, in particular, my virtuoso editor, Sarah Cohen, Danielle Cody-Fatal, Anna Polad, and the entire staff of University of Michigan Press who've supported these two books for the past 11 years, generously and enthusiastically. Our generous hosts here at Ross have been nothing short of amazing. We're here at the Ross Business School. The painful irony is that if Georges Méliès had taken a business degree, then world cinema might very well look radically different than it does today. So I want to thank Greg Barker, Dylan Hancock, Ivory Wright, Lori Woods, and Mary Ventura for all of their support. Steve Beach in Michigan Research helped some of the wheels turn. Big thanks to Dean Ann Curzan for greenlighting some of the necessary funding. Big thanks to my colleagues in the Department of Film, Television, and Media who supported the Méliès biography specifically. Johannes von Moltke, Marcus Nornis, Jada Rivero. Also, my colleagues in the M-Cube program, Philip Hallman, Van Jordan, who helped support the biography through the M-Cubed initiative. We're grateful to the UMOR LSA Open Access Subvention Program and to the Sustainable History Monograph Pilot, which allowed Méliès Boots to be published open access, free to download at no cost to anyone in the world who would like to read the book. Thank you to these generous sponsors. We're grateful to the Mellon Foundation that funded some of our Mellon scholars who you're going to hear from today. Very grateful for their generous support. And no thanks would be complete without my thanks to the staff of the Department of Film, Television, and Media. Mary Lou Klapala, Carrie Moore, Lisa Rode-Barbeau, and Marga Schuer-Campbell. Appreciate Joey Pecoraro, who provided scores for the 3 films today, which you'll hear at the end of the program. David Pfluger generously gave of his collection to illustrate both of these books, and we're very grateful for David's enthusiasm. Robert de la Roche and Latour Verte agreed to have this book, the Méliès biography, published in English. We're grateful for their support and their partnership in bringing this book to English language readers, finally, after so many years. My great thanks go to Madeleine Malthête-Méliès, the late author of the biography, to her daughter, and Marie Malthête-Méliès, who have been generous supporters of this project. Without Anne-Marie's help, this would not exist. Certainly, we're very thrilled to have this book finally available to English readers. And one of the key features you will find at the very end of the book is a marvelous essay by Anne-Marie on her mother and her mother's contributions to film history, which are only now beginning to be recognized, we think. And we hope this book will be a step toward greater recognition for the unbelievable historical work done by Madeleine Malthête. My thanks go out to the Méliès family, Anne-Marie Malthête-Méliès, Abraham Malthête, Jacques Malthête, Marie-Hélène Lachessy. Very grateful for your support of these projects. It's been an honor to get to know you. None of this would have been possible without the author of this biography. And I want to let you in on a little secret. There's a marvelous interview with the author that can be found on the University of Michigan Press website. It's a little hard to find, so I want to direct your attention to exactly where to find it. If you go to the page for Magnificent Méliès, you go to News, Reviews, and Interviews. If you click on that and follow the links to the interview, you will have before you a simply marvelous interview with the author, finally now translated, subtitled in English. Please take a look after the webinar at this great interview. We're grateful to Madame Solange Fechner, Bernard Eisenschitz for helping make that video possible. These two books were the beneficiary of a great team, an amazing team that was the beneficiary of UROP support. And my first collaborator that I want to introduce to you is Rose Albayat, who came to this project as an award-winning journalist. And I soon discovered an incredible film scholar in her own right. Rose was always willing to do what needed to be done for the project. She did it immediately. She did it capably. She did it at a high level. So we're very grateful to Rose's work on this project, and I'd like you to hear from her directly.
Ago, as part of the undergraduate research opportunity program. At the time, I assisted in archiving and creating a database of hundreds of Méliès original sketches and historical photographs from the holdings of the Cinémathèque Française. In addition, I proofread the manuscripts and helped with checking some of the historical facts. But then at the end of winter 2021, Professor Solomon and I had an idea to build Méliès Studio in virtual reality. So I spent that summer and most of the fall semester closely analyzing and examining every historical document and surviving photographs we have of the studio. I also spent that summer teaching myself how to model in 3D, as I had no prior experience in that area back then. In a way, the learning and modeling process was similar to Méliès' process of building the first studio in 1896 and then renovating it several times later. The first version of the studio I built was just a prototype, which mostly served as a learning tool. I remodeled that studio a few times after, but by the beginning of fall 2021, with the help of Stephanie O'Malley and Ted Hall at the Duderstadt Center, as well as UROP's generous monetary support for buying the needed equipment, I was able to create the first functioning draft of Méliès Studio in 3D. That studio also spent through several renovations, but this time was because I kept discovering new essential information. However, as of August 2022, an almost exact replica of the studio was completed. Although we have complete measurements provided by Marie Nover and Jacques Malthête, some interesting challenges presented themselves with the relevant software, which unfortunately were unavoidable. As part of this project, which happens to also be my honors thesis now, I will be filming a creative remake of the living playing cards inside the 3D studio, while still being faithful to Méliès' 1905 film. My film will feature an all-female cast to pay tribute to the many under-researched women who performed on screen and worked behind the scene during the silent era. One way of keeping it faithful is that all of the mise-en-scène will be in all shades of black and white. I truly believe that the best way to learn is to experience. As someone who is very passionate about film history, I want to learn it by experiencing what filmmakers in the early 1900s experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose, for that marvelous account. Let me introduce you now to Jennifer Lipsmeier Guy, who came to the project magically out of nowhere and showed incredible tenacity, persistence, and attention to detail. Certainly some errors crept into both these books, but I can assure you that many more errors would be there had it not been for her meticulous attention to detail and her many sleepless nights, to which I can attest because her emails were time-stamped. Jennifer, thank you so much for all your amazing work on this project, your commitment to the legacy of Georges Méliès.
Thank you, Matthew, for having me. Hello, my name is Jennifer Lipsmeier Guy, and I'm a student of historic preservation, not a film scholar. So I came to the Méliès and the Modern World Project with a little different perspective. As a non-traditional student who returned to college after raising my family, I was grateful to be selected for the summer of 2021 Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program at the University of Michigan. Dr. Solomon invited me to immerse in the Belle Époque for 3 months. That sounded delightful. I arrived on the scene to find the exhaustive body of research Dr. Solomon has compiled over several decades, and these 2 manuscripts. Méliès Boots was practically perfect, requiring little more than a quick proofread for clerical errors. As a native English speaker, the biography was a little more complicated for me. In both of these books, details of French history and the history of the film industry play a prominent role. I've also learned a great deal about the modern publishing industry. In service to the University of Michigan Press's admirable dedication to making its work accessible to the broadest possible audience, my original share of the project was to write alternative text descriptions of the images selected for these 2 books. Alt text is used by screen reader technology, which reads books aloud, including a description of any images. That helps low vision users to appreciate content that they might otherwise miss. I tried to pack as much detail as possible into each description. The catch is that this is done tweet style with a limited number of characters, and I understand that if a line goes longer than allowed, some screen readers simply skip the whole thing, leaving users in the dark about that content. My work also included organizing the spreadsheets of metadata that followed the images through the production process. I thought this would all be quick and easy. As it turned out, you can't describe something accurately if you don't know what it is you're seeing. So quite a bit of study was necessary to learn about all of the events, technologies, and most of all, the remarkable personalities involved. Our translator did a wonderful job of converting the French version into the biography into English. As I read through the 76 years of Méliès' life again and again, I got a sense of who he and his loved ones were. Dr. Solomon welcomed some small vocabulary changes that might better express the sentiments of the original. After my summer term with UROP was complete, he invited me to continue on with the project with generous support from the Mellon Foundation for copy editing and for help with archival research to provide footnotes for some of the more obscure historical details in order to offer context for a modern English-speaking audience. A vast part of my role has been to meticulously, word by word, examine hundreds of pages of text for clarification of French thoughts put into English words. One issue we grappled with was which terms were best left in the original French, for example, certain proper nouns. Because many of Méliès' star film releases were marketed in the United States as well as France, we also ensured the original French and English titles are consistent and correct throughout the book. Within the field of historical research, there is a duty to be as accurate as possible to the facts, but there is also a lot of room for interpretation through contemporary perspectives and through the eyes of the researchers themselves. Our primary concern was fidelity to the original French biography. Magnificent Méliès as the only authorized English biography of Georges Méliès, and Méliès Boots will stand in the Library of Congress as definitive sources for all future English-speaking researchers of Georges Méliès and film history. I'm grateful that this work has been supported by the generosity of the UROP Mellon Scholars Program, which is part of the larger UM Bridges to the Humanities, facilitated by Michelle Ferez. She has an infectious enthusiasm for the Méliès and the Modern World Project. Now, I am a history and historic preservation student at Eastern Michigan University. My research experience with Dr. Solomon in UROP has been invaluable as I've continued on in my studies. It's a joy to see these books finally in print. Congratulations to Dr. Solomon for this wonderful accomplishment, and thank you to the Méliès family for trusting us to ensure that George Méliès would be fairly represented to English-speaking readers. And I would like to publicly acknowledge that Dr. Matthew Solomon has gone beyond all expectations for a simple short-term research mentor. Besides teaching me professional methodology and historical research techniques and the publishing industry, he also makes a great cup of coffee.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our third member of our dream team, Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program, Méliès in the Modern World project member, cannot be with us today because he is teaching fourth grade in the Detroit Public Schools as part of the Teach for America program. So I'm unbelievably proud of Olivier Bahizi, who came to this project in 2019 when the biography seemed to be stalled. We weren't sure we could find support for the translation. We weren't sure the book was going to happen after all, but Olivier waved his magic wand, and with his fluency, with his passion, with what he brought to our team, he put the biography on the road to publication. So although he's not here in present with us, he's agreed to come to you through two messages, one in English, one in French. Thank you, Olivier.
My name is Olivier Bahizi. My role in this project was to facilitate negotiations between University of Michigan Press with La Tour Verte, the French publisher. On the other hand, I translated the first-hand source material from French to English, like Madeleine Malthête-Méliès interviews. With my colleagues, I collected various informations, data, and pictures, which will be used by Dr. Matthew Solomon in his book.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Je m'appelle Olivier Bahizi, je suis né au Rwanda. J'ai fait mes études secondaires et primaires là-bas. Le cinéma et les médias ont été toujours ma passion. Et c'est en poursuivant ce rêve que j'ai rencontré Dr. Matthew Solomon, qui est devenu mon professeur de plusieurs cours d'histoire du cinéma. Avant d'être admis à l'Université de Michigan, je ne savais pas que mes connaissances de langue française et mon expérience en Europe allaient servir à l'aboutissement d'un projet qui tenait à cœur le professeur Solomon, ainsi qu'à la famille de l'illustre Georges Méliès. Les 4 ans que j'ai travaillé sous la guidance du professeur Solomon, j'ai appris beaucoup de choses que je ne pouvais pas acquérir dans les cours classiques. Avec le professeur Solomon, j'ai fait des recherches, établi des contacts, traduit et collecté plusieurs documents et médias qui étaient nécessaires au travail du professeur. C'est avec humilité et reconnaissance que je remercie Dr. Solomon ainsi que la famille Méliès de la confiance qu'ils ont eue en moi en m'intégrant dans leur travail. Merci encore une fois pour cette aventure. Et enjoy your walk. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Olivier. Our next speaker comes to us from Toronto, Canada, our marvelous translator who appeared angelically when we were in need of someone to do this work. And without further ado, Kel Pero.
Hello. Well, I want to thank everyone very much for having given me the wonderful opportunity to work on this book. Sarah Cohen approached me about it originally a couple of years ago, and I was especially grateful to have this opportunity when I learned how long a road Professor Solomon and his colleagues had been on to try to get this work translated. It was a great joy to read. I looked forward to it every time I sat down to do a translation session. I learned about things not just about the subject's life and his work, but also about things as varied as French guild culture and various somewhat obscure points of French history, and also about the denizens of the demi-monde of Paris during Méliès' time. So I was extremely glad again to have been able to do this. It's been a highlight of my career as a translator, and I wish the book great success. I think it's a cracking good read. He just had a very exciting life, and I would encourage anybody who's just interested in interesting lives to read the book. Thank you again very much, Professor Solomon.
Thank you, Kel. What an amazing job you did on this book. I urge all people to have a read. It's a sparkling book, a wonderful translation, and we're glad to finally have it in print. The next part of our show, please put questions into the Q&A and we will address them after a brief presentation on Méliès manufacture and 3 short films. I ask for your indulgence in considering that not just as a magician, because if you're here, you probably know that Georges Méliès was a pioneer filmmaker who made over 520 films. And you may know that he's also a magician. But did you know that he began his professional career as a shoe manufacturer? And that in fact, if you follow my argument, that basis was not irrelevant to what he later did as a film pioneer. So in brief, I'm going to try and convince you that this is a relevant context. We ought to start with Méliès family tree, which you can find in this new edition. And what's worth noting is that for 2 generations on Méliès' father's side, for 3 generations on Méliès' mother's side, he came from families of shoemakers. And the shoe business, shoe distribution, shoe sales, and leatherworking were important parts of the Méliès professional family tree. Méliès' father, Jean-Louis Méliès, was the namesake of one of the biggest brands, one of the most successful luxury brands of footwear in Paris. And Georges Méliès came into this family as the baby of the family. His father worked in shoes. Both of his older brothers worked in shoes. And this context was crucial for the Méliès family. By the 1880s, the brand was extremely well established. There was a factory, and the business was about to be handed to the children. This is the part where Georges Méliès begins to enter the scene. My argument rests on a couple of bullet points when I'm going to try and convince you in rapid fashion that Méliès boots matter. If you want the full argument, you'll have to turn to the book, but I'll give you the snapshot Cliff Notes version. They're both material practices. Filmmaking and shoemaking deal with raw materials that are derived from, in one case, wood pulp, in another case, animal hides. So both filmmaking and shoemaking, if we think about it from the 1900 point of view, very much material practices. There is a tremendous analogy between the cinematograph and the sewing machine, which I don't think we've given enough attention to. These are both mechanisms that rely on intermittent transit, putting something forward long enough for a stitch or an exposure, and then advancing it very quickly. Not a straight rotary motion, but intermittent motion. This is the principle of the cinematograph. It's also the principle of the sewing machine. So this analogy, I think, is worth considering, especially when we look at some of the early apparatus that were used in the 1890s. Another pillar of this analogy is the importance of cutting and joining, which was of paramount importance in constructing shoes, three-dimensional objects that are constructed from two-dimensional materials, and was especially crucial for the cinematic art of Méliès. This is a very telling drawing done by his son, André Méliès, that shows Méliès at work at his workbench, cutting films and being so precise about exactly where those cuts are located. The joke of the drawing, of course, is that nitrate film is highly flammable, but Georges Méliès, despite the sign that bears his name behind him, is smoking while doing so. If we look closely at a Méliès film print, we notice the signs of cutting, and the importance of cutting was at the basis of so many of Méliès' cinematic illusions. These were both products of modern organic chemistry. Celluloid film was a product of the Second Industrial Revolution, revolution in chemicals. The cement and the dyes that were used to join together film strips, that were used also to hand color film strips, those were all products of the modern organic chemical industry. They were Second Industrial Revolution developments, and I think they underlie the cinematic revolutions that Méliès himself was so importantly responsible for. These were goods, shoes on the one hand and films on the other, that were manufactured in iron and glass structures, that were a particular architectural product of the Second Industrial Revolution. So if one takes a look at the Méliès shoe factory on Rue Taylor, and one sees where Méliès shoes and boots were manufactured, we notice that the building, iron and glass architecture, is rather similar to what Méliès later used to manufacture films. The famous studio in Montreuil, the one that now exists in virtual reality, thanks to the amazing work of Rose Albayat. These were manufactured goods, and in both cases, they're embellished by handiwork. They relied on machines in order to produce them, but they also relied on artisanal labor. So we see this illustration from the 1880s French shoe industry press, and we see the way in which machines introduced into the traditional handcraft of shoemaking could create unbelievable efficiency and economies of scale. Méliès' filmmaking operations relied on a similar combination of manufactured products embellished by handiwork. This is something that struck me unmistakably when I had a chance to look at one of the few pairs of surviving Méliès bottines at the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto, to see that these were partly manufactured products made with machines, but also partly hand embellished with embroidery, stitching done by countless female workers to make these the luxury products that consumers would pay very high prices to wear. Méliès applied a similar aesthetic to his films, which were frequently hand-colored. These were deluxe products. They were part of the growth and the spread of luxury products beyond the aristocracy to the upper classes. So Méliès boots, Méliès shoes were purchased by this burgeoning upper middle class that supported luxury brands and supported the international commerce in luxury brands. Come to find out that Méliès shoes were very desirable in places like South America, and that this was an international brand in the same way that Méliès Star Films sought that kind of international reach as a luxury product, as the best that money could buy when it came to film prints. And these are decorated brands, award-winning brands that traded on that elite status. What was also very interesting to find out in studying the French footwear industry trade press is that knockoff shoes were a real danger to producers in the 1880s, in the same way that knockoff films devastated Méliès' film business in the early 1900s. So Méliès shoes were trademarked to try to prevent unauthorized knockoffs. Méliès did very much the same thing in producing physical film prints, which were trademarked to try to protect against unauthorized duplication. And this trademark became known the world over. Certainly by 1902, the Star Film brand was signified the world's best when it came to filmmaking. Last but not least, without the money that Georges Méliès received when he sold his share of the family business to his older brothers, Gaston and Henri, there would have been no Méliès magic, there would have been no Méliès films. So it's that seed money, which came from literally tens of thousands of pairs of shoes, that we can thank the existence of Méliès' tenure as the director of the Theatre Robert Houdin and the hundreds of Méliès films that survive today. If one looks through the Méliès filmography, there's a few films about footwear that are worth noting. Certainly the film Cinderella, of which Méliès made 2 versions, is one of the many kind of shoe fables, fairy tales, as well as other films that we know less about, which involved shoes and boots as part of what is seen on screen. To read a little more about this, I refer you to the University of Michigan Press blog, a blog post, Méliès, It's Gotta Be the Shoes. And if you're truly interested, this book will give you some depth. The book is available for digital download and for purchase at a very generous discount offered by the University of Michigan Press. Eurospan consumers can take advantage of it as well. So now we come to our film program, 3 zero-gravity films from 1902 with new music by Joey Pecoraro. These were films that were made in consecutive order and that left their trace in Méliès film catalogs, which are not unlike the Méliès shoe catalogs. Individual items are itemized and described and priced. So the 3 films that we are going to look at today, all quite short. The first of which is The Human Fly in a hand-colored print, here described in the Méliès Star Film catalog. We're going to see these a little out of order. We're going to go next to An Impossible Balancing Feat, another gravity-defying zero-gravity film. And we're going to close our little program with Marvellous Suspension and Evolution, a film that has not been widely available in 120 years, comes to us thanks to the Library of Congress, thanks also to Zoran Sinabad, who helped with this, and the support of UROP for the digitization. This was a film based on a magical fairground illusion in which a woman kind of rotated in impossible ways in midair. Here we see an image of Harry Keller performing the feat. It was performed by a number of magicians in the late 19th century. Méliès decided to do a version of it, but instead of using the tricks and techniques that would have been used on stage, Méliès turned to a specifically cinematic trick of shooting with an overhead high-angle camera. And he did this in all three of the films that you're about to see. It was a trick that, as far as I know, he had not used before, and a trick that he did not use again after. A few years later, it was known and exposed in images like this, how such a thing would have been done. But for your enjoyment, we are delighted to have a score specially composed by Joey Pecoraro. Yes, that Joey Pecoraro, the one who collaborated with Adele. He has graced us with a marvelous soundtrack. He will also be appearing at the Blind Pig. I've got my tickets. Get yours. See Joey, hear Joey, enjoy his scores for these films.
Yeah. Cheap. Say, wait, let's see what this is.
Hey, Casey. Maybe I don't see. Maybe I don't see. I close my eyes just a little, and I can see him.
I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. And so I'd like to welcome back to the stage Rose Albayat, who's going to help out with the Q&A. Thanks, Rose.
So someone asked, many of Méliès films were eventually sacrificed for celluloid and shoe heels. Is that true? And was that on his initiative?
There is a long-standing story that the celluloid that Méliès used for his negatives and for his positive film prints was recycled to make shoe heels. That story has come down to us. It's impossible to confirm. It's impossible to deny likewise. So we probably will never know whether or not that is actually true. Celluloid was used. It was used in various parts of shoes. Some of it might have been repurposed film, but we won't know for sure whether that was the life cycle of Méliès films, whether they actually ended up back on people's feet. It's just impossible to know, but it's a great anecdote.
Awesome. And then another question is, it seems that Méliès must have done a version of the Indian rope trick with the boy vanishing up a rope. Did he?
If he did, I'm not aware of it. That is a trick that I do not know him to have ever performed. I'm not saying it's impossible that he did, but I've never seen any documentation of that or even a cinematic version.
Thank you. Tom Gunning is asking, the rotating of the woman in the last film is complex, presumably done by rotating the camera, but that is unusual. Can you confirm how it was done?
I don't know exactly, Tom, how that was done. I know how it was done on stage. It involved a very special harness. I don't think that Méliès rotated the camera to create that illusion. I believe it to be one of his many kind of black art effects. But one of the remarkable things about Méliès is we don't actually still know how he did some of his tricks. I think for many generations, people thought Méliès made things disappear by stopping and starting the camera and changing things in between. But the research of Jacques Malthête and others showed us it was never that simple. There was always a cut to make the thing disappear or appear. We've only had a couple weeks to really study Marvellous Suspension and Evolution. So it's a great question. Would love to find out how it was done. Would love to compare that to how it was done on the magic stage, because it was a fairly widely used magic illusion on the stage and even in French fairground shows at that time. My hunch is that Méliès used some kind of tricks of mise en scène, some tricks that were in front of the camera, and combined that with some level of matting and double exposure. But in some cases, some of these illusions may have died with Méliès. We may never know. To me, that's the fascination, the marvel, and the mystery of Méliès. But I'd love to take another look and see if we can come up with a better answer.
Thanks. Someone asked a very small question, but I seem to thinking I was seeing perspective lines suggesting depth in the second film you showed. Is that correct? If so, are there other films where Méliès actually suggests depth and not just tableau?
There's a few Méliès films that certainly the Méliès films that were shot out of doors, there's a few films that he shot out of doors where we see a fair amount of depth, but in general, as this knowledgeable question asker surmises, much of the effect and the aesthetic of Méliès films is based on a kind of resolutely, fairly two-dimensional tableau aesthetic. The only thing that I would add is that it's very much a kind of layered aesthetic where we have layered backdrops in some cases. So resolutely two-dimensional backdrops, but sometimes flat props, flat side pieces that occupy the middle ground. So true depth of field is very rare in Méliès. It's there again in the sensational arson film that he made partly out of doors. But for the most part, what we do see in Méliès films, certainly in the three we looked at just now, is that very distinctive tableau, quasi-theatrical aesthetic.
Eric Dietrich, sorry for butchering the name. He says, wonderful research and impressive presentation today. Your research shows some important and compelling influence on the family shoe boot business on Méliès' film career. Do you find any reciprocal influence back onto the shoe boot business from his film business?
It's a good question, Eric, and I thank you for asking it. One coincidence that has always struck me is that the last of the Méliès shoe business really kind of bankrupted in 1895, right around the time that Méliès began making films later that year. So certainly in our modern era, no shoe promotion is complete without a very dynamic audiovisual moving image presentation. We know that Méliès made a number of advertising films right around 1900. As far as I know, he made advertising films for a couple of fashion products, but not for shoes. The Theatre Robert Houdin was located very near a tailor. The world of fashion was always inculcated, intermingled with the work of Méliès, but I wouldn't venture to say that the influence ever really turned back the other way until we get to, let's say, the 1980s with the kinds of shoe commercials we see then.
Diana Anselmo, again, sorry. She says, great talk. Can you talk a little bit about the role personal materials plays in your own relationship with doing film historiography?
Great question, Diana. Thank you for being here. Thank you for asking it. I think one of the kind of aha moments for me as a researcher was physical encounters with certain materials. That just changed the way I thought about this subject. I really could no longer think of them as virtual objects, as streaming video, but I had to understand them as material artifacts. So one of those key encounters was a visit to the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto, where Elizabeth Semmelhack, took out that pair of marvelous Méliès bottines, let me examine it up close, showed me the stitching, helped me to understand how it was constructed. And I think, that kind of material encounter changes the way one thinks. That's why I'm so invested in VR educationally, because I think learning is embodied. And I think learning takes on a new character when other parts of our body get involved. So certainly that was a, aha moment there in Toronto. Another aha moment was at the Library of Congress when, for the first time, I got to see the bound volumes of Méliès illustrations for his cousin Adolphe's caricature journal. These massive volumes, huge caricature pages, and to really kind of sit there and really examine the image and attend to all the details and try and figure out what was in those, to then turn the pages. It's just a different experience. And I want my students to have that, to encounter physical primary source materials, not only as digitized resources, which are, wonderful and unbelievably helpful. But I do think there's something that goes on in that physical encounter with artifacts. You have some kind of experience when you spin this praxinoscope, which is a little bit off screen, but when you actually interact with this machine, you have a little different kind of learning experience. And for me, that was crucial to what I felt like was my breakthrough in researching Méliès. And so it's a great question, and I think it's crucial. And I hope that in the future, as teachers, as researchers, we can actualize not just our eyes and our ears, but other parts of our body, in the research process. What Rose is doing with VR is exactly, I think, generating breakthroughs, because if you're going to build it, you really have to understand it in a whole different way than just reading about it or studying it analytically. So I hope this is the future. I think it's the future. Thanks for a great question, Diana.
David Mayer is asking, following your linking of Méliès to the Second Industrial Revolution, to what extent did electricity play a part in the machinery of shoe manufacturing and filmmaking?
Great question, David. Thank you for being here. I'm honored that you'd be in the audience. Electricity was, I think, a bit less important than it was for some other industries. So the shoe factory was lit by gaslight. I think the machines were run by steam power. Electricity was a bit less important for Méliès in the shoe business and in the film business. Méliès didn't really start using electric lights until about 1907. So electricity, quite frankly, was a lot less important for the actual manufacturing. Where it was especially important was in placing the orders. I think a large volume of these orders came in by telegraph, came in through electrical communication. So not so much maybe in the actual manufacturing, production part of the process, but certainly propped up infrastructure, in other ways. There's a great story about the time Méliès tried to shoot with electrical light. He tried to do it in his lab, and he blew up the transformer. So electricity for Méliès' way of making things was not especially important. All the cameras were hand cranked, all the projectors were hand cranked. But it maybe was when it comes to the communication, possibly transportation infrastructure that kind of propped up, the world that Méliès supplied with these films, and that he fictionalized this modern world in his films. So great question. Thank you, David.
Joe Pecoraro is asking, was Georges the first filmmaker to use double exposure in film?
So Joey, thanks for that question. Probably not the first. So firsts can be misleading. He was, most certainly not the first, but he used it rather systematically, and he used it extensively. And what I would say he did is he used it in combination with other kinds of illusions to create novel effects. So the trick of double exposure was well known as early as 1898, but to use it in combination with other effects, I think, is where we see the true magic of Méliès, combining a couple different effects into one, rather than, as we saw in that Balancing Feet film, double exposure, but with an overhead camera. So I think we find in Méliès, it's never just a simple trick. It's usually in combination with others. Thank you for that question.
Susan McGraw says, excellent representation of this genius's work. So wonderful to see. How can one get introduced to this filmmaker at an early age?
There's no better time. I say start them young. My son was watching A Trip to the Moon, not always voluntarily. I think at 6 years age. I think these are timeless films. I think they work for children, they work for adults. They're widely available in some versions better than others. But I say the sooner the better. There's a joy, a refusal to go by the rules, and a kind of exuberance that I think everybody should experience, but children especially. So my kids have sat through more than a few screenings of Méliès, and they could probably tell you what they think. But I think the sooner the better. Get them started now.
I agree. What was one of the most surprising things you learned in creating these books?
I think this has got to be our last question. We're pretty much out of time. I think the real surprise was the boundless capacity of Georges Méliès, his tireless innovation, his creativity, who he seems to have been as a person and the way that he inspired others. So that was always a kind of surprise to read a new version of that and to see how it extended. And I think there's no better guide to the 21st century than Georges Méliès. So with that, I'll leave you. Thank you for joining us. If you want a recording of this broadcast, it will come to you by email as a registered participant. Buy some books, enjoy the films. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.